Hi, everyone. Rakesh Khurana, Dental Dean of Harvard College. Really hope everybody's doing well and staying healthy. Excited to continue our dialogue series with our faculty. And today I'm just delighted to have Michael Pollan, just one of our great scholars of where culture and society and our personal choices and food and all the sort of networks of systems that sort of affect our everyday experience is just operates at the intersection of that. We're fortunate to have him as also the Louis K. Chan Professor of Arts and lecturer professor of practice at Harvard. He needs almost no introduction, just incredible. You can go on Netflix and watch an incredible series, Cooked, award-winning writer, award-winning editor, just Michael, I'm just so delighted you were able to make some time today. So thank you.
Oh, sure, Rakesh. Very good to be here with you.
Good. So I happened to have, day before yesterday, gotten my new New York Review of Books. And, you know, the title of the article you have is The Sickness in Our Food Supply. And before we get into that, I was wondering if you might share a little bit from your perspective. What is, you know, the pandemic kind of has in some ways revealed already existing things, in other places deepened like inequalities as well. It also, as you know, again, it's often too soon to tell what aspects of historical moments it will accelerate. And I was just wondering, for you as an individual, how have you experienced it? How have you thought about it as an individual and also as an intellectual?
Well, it's been a very interesting period on many levels. You know, I have to make clear that, you know, I'm not suffering from it the way so many people are. You know, I don't know many people close to me who have gotten sick. I have an elderly mother. It's a very bad time to have an elderly parent. That's probably the biggest stress. She's locked down in New York City, very far away, and beyond my ability to do much except call her every day. But it's provided this amazing space for contemplation. And I have found that, you know, first there's the gift of time. I mean, I had a very active speaking schedule. I was flying all over the country as soon as the semester ended. And suddenly all these weeks opened up where I had no plans. And so it's been a very interesting moment to observe everything from the food system and what, you know, what this pandemic is teaching us, and also observing your own mind. And because we're in this funny state where we can't change our circumstance, we can only change the way we look at it. I mean, that's the arena where we're operating to an unusual degree. Usually we're consumed by outward things and projects and intentions. And those, you know, those outward things are kind of in abeyance in a way. So it's been an interesting time. I've spent a lot of time journaling and reflecting on what's going on and what we're learning. And you know, it's also been a very depressing time because it is exactly the kind of event, if you look at history, that normally brings people together, as wars often do and as crises often do. And you know, thanks to the politics of our moment and the lack of leadership in Washington, this has turned out to be a very divisive moment. And the idea that a public health tool like a mask should be turned into a political symbol is just, no one could have imagined that, you know, just a few weeks ago. So I'm trying to make the best of it, and, you know, realize that I'm limited kind of geographically in what I can do. I'm a reporter, and, you know, I had so many plans to go places and report for my next book, and people I wanted to meet. I meet them on Zoom. That's the best I can do. And it's no substitute, let me tell you, for really taking someone's measure in person and establishing that kind of bond. And so that part's been very frustrating. But there are other parts that I think have been a blessing.
Thanks for sharing that. Well, you know, I forgot we were fellow New Yorkers. I grew up in Queens, and
yeah.
so and I think you grew up in Long Island, if I remember
That's
correctly.
right.
And you know, and thanks for sharing about your mom. I think all of us who are have family and friends, and right now can't, as you said, connect with them in person. It is challenging, and we worry about so many people. I know so many people who've been watching this are affected in so many different ways, and I think, you know, opportunities to dialogue about this and just sort of share that is important. And I know that Zoom is a poor substitute for in-person interaction as well.
And yet imagine if we didn't have it.
Exactly. And I think, you know, what it is a reminder of is, first of all, you know, I've talked to some people, they talk about Zoom exhaustion, and, you know, that, you know, they often are tired at the end of the day. And what's really interesting is often when we're present with each other, we energize each other. And I think that's sort of like,
I think that's right.
yeah, that's one of the things that I think people are really missing and maybe an appreciation for. And so, you know, as a thought about appreciation, you know, one of the things that you have shared a lot about, you've written so much in so many different areas, but, you know, I'd love to talk a little bit about what, you know, food, it's also, this moment has brought us back to food. We read about shortages, we read about the frontline folks who are there providing for us, and yet also seem to be often the least cared for. The emergency declaration on meat plants. I mean, how do you make sense of this? What's a kind of framework or perspective we should bring through this?
Well, you know, I think what we're seeing is a stress test on the food system. We have developed over the last 40 years, really in the post-war period, a food system of incredible efficiency. Food is very cheap in America. We spend less per capita of our per capita income on food than anybody in the history of civilization. People can eat meat, you know, 3 times a day, and many people do. That's unheard of. We don't have to think about food. It shows up. It's in the supermarket. We don't have to think about the work that goes into producing it. It's been like magic, and of course we've taken it for granted. But you know, people have been pointing out that this is an unsustainable system for a long time, since the 70s on and off, with the rise of the organic movement. And people have been pointing out to the fact we're exhausting our soil, that this depends on undocumented labor that's, you know, badly exploited, that Eric Schlosser documented how brutal the meat plants were, and that no labor rights to the people who actually are slaughtering these animals and cutting them up for us so we can enjoy them. But that message has been kind of ignored, and but I think it is loud and clear right now that efficiency is always operating in a relationship to resiliency, and that you can't have both at the same time. That resiliency implies a kind of suppleness and redundancy in a system. So for example, meat shortages. You know, we have this situation where it turns out that a single meat packing plant in Sioux City was slaughtering 5% of the pork in America. That's how concentrated this industry has become. And when that place had to be closed down by the public health authorities and the governor, suddenly there were shortages. There wasn't enough pork in the system. And that would never have happened if we still had thousands of local meat plants and tens of thousands of hog farmers instead of these giant concentrated CAFOs where they're now raised. So the efficiency of that system, which made meat really cheap, is also very vulnerable to shocks like a pandemic. And I thought it was very telling that the president invoked his powers under the Defense Production Act not to get industry to produce more to coronavirus test kits, which we badly need, but to force meat plant workers back to work, even though they were frightened with good reason, because they're being infected at incredible rates. Now, when an industry can force a president to do its dirty work, that's a sign that that industry wields too much power in our political system. And that, of course, is exactly what we have the antitrust laws passed 100 years ago to deal with. The fact that you don't want these undue concentrations of power because they distort our politics. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing. I mean, there are many lessons of this, but we've learned that that level of concentration is very dangerous. And with the result that these meat plant workers, 20,000 of whom have been infected so far and 66 have died, have been forced back on the lines. And they've reopened these places and without any mandatory safety measures and no OSHA enforcement at all. So that's a a dangerous situation. I actually think we still will get meat shortages fairly soon because you can't operate these plants with so many sick workers.
Michael, can I ask two questions on that? So, it's interesting that you brought up that, this accelerated in the post-war period. I'm reminded, and I'm not an expert at all, of, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle,
Yeah.
which was about, in part, the meat producing industry, and in part, probably emblematic of the sort of concentration and economies of scale and the application of kind of Fordism and division of labor that we are now dealing with today. Tell me a little bit about what I think that books like that, and there was a number of other writers at the time, journalists often, or journalists trained, who increased the revelation in a lot of areas like this. What was that political moment like? Obviously, history doesn't replicate itself, but what does it take to, when we now have time on our hands, to kind of re-examine our point of arrival, to rethink what we want to bring with us into living with COVID-19 and into a post-COVID-19 world, and what we want to leave behind, and how does that happen? How do you change a system? Your article describes a very robust, resilient system in a certain sense that, despite efforts to change it, it reproduces its outcome in a kind of an overdetermined way. So I'd love to hear a little bit how you reconcile that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting you should point to that moment of Upton Sinclair, which I think is published in 1906. And that book, the power of his storytelling, it was a novel, but it was a deeply reported novel, major reforms. Theodore Roosevelt read it, and it led directly to a whole new regulatory regime. And a few years later, we had antitrust laws. And in 1920, I think, we had 5 companies controlled 80% of the beef market, slaughtered 80% of the beef. And the trust busters broke that up because it was regarded as a dangerous for the country and really bad for the ranchers and producers who obviously have no competition for their products. They're forced to sell to one of these companies, which divide up the country regionally. Guess what? Today we have 4 companies slaughtering 85% of the beef. So it's worse than it was then. So what will it take now? Well, I'm an optimist. So you could discount what I have to say, but I do see the potential here, and this goes beyond food, that there is a new politics that could rise out of this pandemic. Everything that it has exposed, it's been like this powerful X-ray in our society. And you mentioned earlier essential workers. This is a term you didn't hear before. These were taken for granted workers, by and large. These are the people, 1 in 7 jobs is in the food system. And these are the people who we depend on to put food in the grocery stores and in the restaurants. And we have treated them as interchangeable, disposable, not worth paying a living wage. And yet suddenly we're calling them essential workers because we realize we can't function without them, that the wheels would fly off our society if they didn't continue to do what they're doing. They're still keeping us fed while most of us sit around, on Zoom. It seems to me that's a moment of a potential political awakening. For them to seize the leverage that they recognize, and I think we'll see more labor actions and more organizing among essential workers, but for us also to realize that our fate and theirs are intertwined, and that, if they have sick leave, paid sick leave, if they have health insurance, that's just not a nice act of generosity. That helps us. That keeps them healthier. That keeps them from going to work when they're sick and infecting other people. So that I think the concept of essential workers should be encouraging us to see things in a more communal, collective way. And I think there is potential to develop a politics explicitly around addressing all the vulnerabilities that the pandemic has exposed. And one would be obviously a living wage and benefits to essential workers, treating them in a way that reflects their importance to our society and our well-being. It would also involve decentralizing this food system and deindustrializing it to some extent. That we need to build more redundancy and we need to support local food systems. They have actually functioned quite well. They've been able to pivot from sales to restaurants to instead farmers markets and direct to consumers selling, CSA boxes. And they've had a kind of nimbleness that these giant companies have not, because they can only do one thing. So we need to support those local food systems. We need to make it possible for people on SNAP, on food stamps, to be able to buy food online like the rest of us are doing. They can't do that right now in many places, most places. So, I'm hopeful. I see that that the nominee of the Democratic Party, presumptive nominee, is moving in this direction in his policy platforms. I mean, I think there's a recognition that we are perhaps entering another reform movement. But of course, it all depends on what happens in the election this fall. We're poised on a knife edge as a society here, and it can go this way or that way. And so I think all of us need right now and this fall to be very engaged politically. I think it's the best thing we can do.
I really appreciate that. It's interesting when you talk about like all the, in that sort of rich discussion, all the things that, have gotten us here, but also what are the opportunities that we have to go ahead and to move forward. And it's interesting that the metaphor of network, which is, a distributed system, is sort of increasingly seen as the metaphor for the 21st century, the way, say, bureaucracy or Fordism was the metaphor for the 20th century. And yet, while businesses and other organizations use and recognize the importance of networks, we haven't reorganized our economy for that sort of multiple aspect with lots of distribution and a kind of disintermediation of all of that. And I guess my question would be, and then I'd love to hear how we as individuals, as citizens and individuals in society, as consumers, as voters, as civic minded people who want to give more than we take, what we can do. But I'd love to sort of understand a little bit, because when I think about a system, part of what holds it together is there's a sort of supply side, there's a demand side, and there's a regulatory side. Mm-hmm. And these sort of obviously it's more complicated than that, but they seem to come together to kind of produce outcomes. What can we as individual citizens and citizen leaders do to sort of affect those different areas?
Well, besides voting, which is more essential today than it's ever been, and maybe quite challenging, actually, it may take some heroism to cast a vote this fall in the midst of a pandemic and efforts at voter suppression. We all have other votes, of course. We have the votes of our food dollars. I mean, one of the most encouraging things we've seen in the midst of all this consolidation I've been talking about is that we have been building local food economies all over the country. And that was not the result of policy changes. That was really the result of consumers voting with their dollars for a different kind of food, for buying animals from humane farmers, for buying organic food or local food. And this whole market now in organic and local food, which is probably something like $50 billion now, was really built by consumers acting as citizens, in effect. And that we have to understand that the consumer can at the same time be a citizen, that you can vote your values, not just your narrow self-interest. It may cost a little more money, it's true. These alternatives tend to cost more than supermarket food. But then you have to think about, well, how important is food to your well-being and to your happiness and your health? And is it a place to cut corners? Or perhaps it's a place to, make an investment, because it is an investment in your health. One of the surprising things I learned was, how important having a healthy diet is to prevent, or to making it less likely you will get a serious case of COVID-19. Look who ends up in the hospital. 48% have obesity, according to the CDC. About the same amount have hypertension. 30% have type 2 diabetes. These are all chronic diseases linked to diet. So cheap food is very expensive in the long run. And I think that one of the most important things we can do is support, especially these small farmers today, and help this local food economy grow and expand and prove its value to the society. So I'm a great believer in, I don't think it's, you know, everything. It's not enough. We also need changes at the level of policy. We need new agricultural policies. We need new antitrust policies. But in the meantime, while we're working for that, we can all do something. And that's one of the reasons I think that the food issue or the food movement has seized the imagination of so many young people. That there's a lot of issues we're dealing with that just are overwhelming. What do you do about, you know, about climate change and the environmental crisis and the political crisis? Well, food's something where, you know, 3 times a day you're making choices, and we're seeing the impact of those choices on this new market. So I think that that's a very hopeful thing. And this period now, it's never more important to eat well as get exercise and sleep well. I mean, these are very important. The health of your immune system may be, you know, may determine everything about what happens going forward.
Well, on that thoughtful, helpful, and
Hopeful.
hopeful note, I just want to thank you. You know, there's nothing been great about COVID-19 or good, but one of the things that I think it does do, as you said, is it's given us a moment to sort of see the machine kind of stop for a second and examine its parts. And very rarely do you get a chance to do that. And what you see is that this is a machine created by people. And that means we can change it.
And choices.
And we can, and we've made choices as a society. And that means that it's not something out there. It's something we can do something about collectively, individually. And I just want to sort of thank you for that message. I want to thank you for your time and just appreciate your thoughtful remarks. And I hope everybody is healthy and happy for everyone around you.
Thank you. Likewise, Rakesh. It's a great pleasure to speak to you.
You too. Have a great day.
Take care.
You too.